Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this lovely spring evening. We opened our new exhibit here at the Concord Museum, Every Path Laid Open, Women of Concord in the Quest for Equality this week. I hope you can come visit. Our focus tonight concerns the quest for equality in the political realm, and we're honored to have the only woman to serve as governor of our Commonwealth, Jane Swift, with us here this evening. I first met Governor Swift in 1996 when I was working with low-income high school students in Western Massachusetts. She was running for Congress after a successful stint as state senator from her home city of North Adams, where she made a name for herself as having been the youngest woman ever elected to the state Senate, and for her successful efforts in reforming education and human services. She began her race for Congress some 60 points behind the incumbent and narrowly lost by only 4 percentage points. I should note she similarly won over my Upward Bound students that summer when meeting them at the Northfield Mount Hermon School. Not only did they not warm to Congressman John Olver the way they did to her, but again, Congressman Olver, to put it mildly, was never known for his charisma. 2 years later, Jane Swift successfully ran as lieutenant governor, helping the Cellucci-Swift ticket win a very narrow statewide victory by running better than expected in her home geographic stronghold of Berkshire County. And just 2.5 years after that, she became governor when Paul Cellucci became our ambassador to Canada. As governor, she won widespread praise for her response to the September 11th attacks and for her management of the fiscal crisis that ensued, which the Boston Herald deemed, quote, her finest hour, describing her leadership at that time as steady, stable, calming, and decisive. She's also remembered, and we'll likely discuss later in the forum, for being the only sitting governor to give birth to twins, no less, while in office. And she was pregnant with her first daughter during the 9 months when she was running for lieutenant governor, which became a national news story. We'll likely also discuss some of the challenges she faced related to being a working mother, but let me conclude this introduction in congratulating her as her twins will turn 20 in just 9 days, and she has survived the teenage years with all 3 of her remarkable and accomplished daughters. For the sake of time, I'll offer abbreviated biographies of our 2 other speakers. Eileen McNamara is the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who wrote for years for the Boston Globe and has covered many female politicians, successful and otherwise, in our Commonwealth through the years. She now teaches journalism at Brandeis University. She and I know each other from when I worked at the Kennedy Library, and she wrote the first definitive biography of Eunice Shriver. Our final speaker is Lisa Wong, who at age 28 was elected the mayor of Fitchburg, the city's first Asian American mayor and the first Asian American female mayor in the state of Massachusetts. Lisa grew up in North Andover. Her parents owned a Chinese restaurant in Haverhill where she worked as a child. With her parents' support, she pursued her education and her dream of working in the public sector, beginning in Fitchburg as part of the Redevelopment Authority. When first elected mayor, the city was on the edge of financial ruin. During her first of 4 terms in office, she had to make tough choices, including turning off half of the street lamps across the city, cutting library hours, and reducing her own salary. By the time she chose not to run for re-election to a 5th term, she had built up the city's reserves from $10,000 to $3 million, prompting Standard & Poor's to twice upgrade the city's bond rating. Lisa is currently the town manager of Winchester, and unfortunately, their town meeting got unexpectedly extended to this evening, so she'll need to leave the session at 7:30. So first, let me thank you all so much for joining us this evening. Let's begin at the macro level. Like Governor Swift and Mayor Wong, one of the women who've succeeded in politics in our state is Elizabeth Warren. As you all likely know, she has a new book out, which I confess I haven't read, but the reviews suggest it's quite thoughtful account of her recent presidential campaign and more self-critical than your average politician. Perhaps I should say your average male politician. She writes about how in her 2 campaigns, she was often running in the shadow of Martha Coakley and Hillary Clinton. And as we know, those are not shadows that billow one's sails. While I believe she does not blame gender on her loss to Joe Biden, she does believe it played a role. I'll just note parenthetically that my 2 sisters and mother are pretty good bellwethers for me. And whereas, and I'm showing my politics here a little, and I promise I don't want this evening's conversation to be partisan in any way, but whereas I liked and could have easily voted for either Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton in a primary or general campaign, the female members of my own family were at times turned off to those 2 candidates. So let's begin, Governor Swift, with you. Is there a double standard for women candidates? Have we as a society made progress since the time that you were in elected office? And why is it so darn hard for women to break through the political glass ceiling?
So I could spend the entire rest of our forum answering that question, but I'm so excited to hear both former Mayor Wong and Eileen McNamara, and I don't know, the May surprised me there speak that I won't. Yes, there's a double standard, but it's gotten considerably better in the 2 decades since I left office. I was saying before we went live, when I served in public office in the state Senate as lieutenant governor and as governor, there wasn't a single member of our congressional delegation who was female. That is obviously vastly different today. We had never had a woman senator. We certainly had never had a woman vice president. So there is slow progress, nowhere near fast enough for me. And as you articulate, and as I hope we'll further explore during tonight, sometimes the biases and where you find them are really interesting. They are not always among the groups that you'd expect. Young people tend to be more open-minded, so your outward bound group, I think, does give us hope. My children, their peers who are in their 20s, don't see labels and don't see gender, race, and class in quite the same way, certainly, that my parents did. But we also shouldn't see things one-dimensionally. Fitchburg, where Lisa was the mayor, I lost by 100 votes in a terrible Republican year. No one would have guessed that. But there was a hardworking group of individuals who respected that I asked for their vote, and that really could relate to me. And if you took a narrow view of the types of people who might vote for women, you wouldn't go to Fitchburg, but they were part of my surprising show in that race. And frankly, it was the vote totals that I got in places like Fitchburg and Gardner that led Governor Cellucci to put me on his ticket. And part of the opportunity I had, the greatest privilege of my life, to serve as governor of the Commonwealth.
So Mayor Wong, why don't we go to you, and maybe both the macro question, but also if you want to comment on the role gender might have played in your early elections.
So first, I want to say that I have directly benefited from the path that Governor Swift and others have paved for me. I will absolutely acknowledge that part of my incentive to get into office as well was to pave the path for my daughter and others in the future to make it easier. When I say pave the path, I mean, it sounds lovely on a nice, spring day, but it is full of heartache and tears and physical and mental scars, which we can look back with humor, I think. But at the same time, when you're in the moment, it is incredibly difficult. And I will say that some of the work that I've done 10, 12 years ago as an elected official has paved the way for even what I'm doing right now. I was 7 months pregnant when I was interviewing for the town manager job. There are many, many more communities with town managers. Hundreds of communities have town managers for hundreds of years. I'm also the first Asian to be a town manager, which I think is in some ways even a more remarkable feat, even though you're going after 5 votes. Sometimes it's harder to get those 3 out of 5 votes. I only got 3. I had a 1 no and 1 abstention, and it was hard. That was a hard process. And that's a whole nother book for another day. But I will say that what I have found having run for office also in my early 20s is, I had a lot of girlfriends who I talked to that were in other sectors, law, finance, medicine. We all went through very similar issues, workplace harassment, just a lot of barriers. And I found out that I was really the only one who could not only speak out against it and be public and try to influence public policy, but that it would actually be a benefit to, um, first of all, my self-esteem, but also my reputation to stand up and fight for these things I really care about. And even to this day, a decade and a half later, there are so many women who are facing issues that have so publicly played out for us here that still don't have that voice. So what the pandemic in particular has changed a few things. It has made us, in some ways, incredibly negative, in some ways opportunistic, break down that work personal life barrier. But it's also made, you hear, like I was hearing stories earlier today about how I was at a workplace summit for the National Conference of Women, and hearing that in some ways women have benefited from having a neutral name and having their screen off when people have assumed that they were men. So having the benefits of people thinking that you're male is not exactly progress in my book. I think we've got a long, long way to go.
So Eileen, you are a longtime observer of this phenomenon and female candidates and elected officials. What observations would you like to share as we open?
Well, I think that Elizabeth Warren makes a point in her new book, which is really sort of a meditation on policy as much as it is a memoir of her presidential campaign, that gender's a trap. Mm-hmm. That if you're a female candidate and you're subjected to sexism on the campaign trail, which I guarantee you will be, if you complain about it, or if you even call attention to it, you're a whiner and a complainer, and that doesn't sit well with the public. If you ignore it, you encourage it. And a lot of the problems I think that women candidates face have their origins in my profession. Because, Governor Swift and I didn't agree on most issues when she was governor of Massachusetts, but we certainly agreed on this issue, that she took it on the chin time and time again for issues that were not issues at all, that were just absolutely sexism run amok. And until we stop asking whether a candidate is likable or electable, both of which questions are only ever asked about women, we're just not going to get very far. We're going through a great reckoning now on race, where journalists are asking themselves really important questions about the presumptions they bring to the table when they're writing about race. Well, I'd like to see us question some of the assumptions that we bring to the table about gender.
Governor Swift, maybe you can react to Eileen's or Elizabeth Warren's suggestion of gender being a trap, and how that played out for you.
So certainly, I used to say often that there's no crying in baseball or politics in Massachusetts. And Eileen is right. There is no winning to complaining about gender issues. I will say, since leaving politics, I have made it a practice. I don't do a lot of politics, but I do speak up often and loudly when there are issues that are unfair about women in politics. Particularly, I speak up when they impact women in another party, because my voice is much more powerful when I talk about the gender issues that I think are unfair, impacting women in a different party, because people will know that I'm not speaking out of just partisanship. And so I think one of the benefits of there being more of us is there are more voices, and while we may be silenced and unable to speak out, that it is empowering, as the mayor said, to be able to speak out, and you can speak out once you've left office even more, I think, with more impact. I will also say, now that I'm 20 years out, one of the things that has been just tremendously moving to me, and I want the mayor to know this as she thinks about her daughter. I have had a number of young women come up to me over the last several years who have told me that their lives were impacted by seeing me in a position of power. So as ugly, I worried a lot when I was in office, that the days that felt really unfair and frankly ugly, and like I could do nothing right in the eyes, yes, of the media, that I was actually messing it up for the next generation. What most young girls actually saw wasn't the day-to-day muck, but somebody who looked like them in the office. And the power of that image, as some of these young people in professions tell me today, makes a huge difference. And I wish I had known that then, because that is, I think, why things are changing. But I will tell you that the next day stories, which are now the next hour stories, I hated Gymboree or whatever it was called. Whenever I would make a mistake, which, you know, I'm human, that's not a news story, but I would occasionally make a mistake, as do all male politicians. There would inevitably be a, you know, sprint to the place where mothers who were not working spent time, and it was usually a Gymboree, and they were all thin and blonde too, which annoyed me for other reasons. And there would be this interview of, you know, oh my goodness, does this let you down that Jane Swift did this? Nobody runs to the golf course when a guy does something wrong and asks men if they believe that it is going to hurt the prospects of all men, that, you know, Speaker X or Congressman Y just messed something up. And those are the types of stories that just prolong the bad press, that you just, you know, start to feel the pile on that makes it hard to escape.
So I want to pursue that with you and Eileen later in the forum, but since Lisa only has a few more minutes with us, and I don't want to rush this next topic. So Lisa, especially in the wake of yet another case of anti-Asian violence in San Francisco yesterday, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share with us the recent decision you made to speak publicly, I believe for the first time, about the anti-Asian discrimination and harassment that you've experienced in your career as a public official. So I'll give you the moment to do that here.
Sure. And if I could actually just link that to something that the governor had mentioned, I strongly believe that vulnerability and showing it is strength. I think in just the mentoring I've done, it's often the fear of the unknown, of what happens when you make that mistake. What if you're not perfect? That prevents people from doing it in the first place. And frankly, because we're human and we make mistakes all the time, I think that the grace that the governor has showed and all of the things that have come her way, I think all the mistakes that I've made in public, I think that is more important for people to see. Absolutely relates to with anti-Asian sentiment that is only really coming to light. It has been in this country for centuries. It has been systematic. It has been embedded in the laws of Congress. It is in every community. It is a lived experience of mine for the past 4 decades I've been on this planet, and it's a lived experience of just about every Asian American that I know. Just the trauma that we face, the microaggressions, the racism. I mean, I don't want to list the horrors, but essentially, it is so common that I'm shocked even now, as somebody who speaks out, how little of all the things that I've said publicly has my lived experience in that respect been part of the words that I've used to make change, how I've used my platform. And I'm surprised by how, you know, a lot of the things that we're saying right now, that is again about our common lived experiences, there's not a lot of history of highlighting it in the ways that we have. I think it's incredibly important for us to really reflect on just the larger systems at play, and not just only what is happening. And I don't want to undermine what is happening to Asians right now and to say like we should have a larger focus, but when you're talking about systems of oppression, you have to look at these larger systems at play in order to make real differences. And that, I think, is where there's a strong role for publicly policymakers, for the media to play, for all residents to play, to say, what is leading to this? I'm speaking out about what's happening to me, a 41-year-old, extremely privileged person with a big platform, many connections, and a lot of ways to find psychological safety, and though I have areas which I don't. A year before I was making the news, a Winchester high school student had won a New York Times essay contest outlining just exactly what I was saying, but his experience in high school. And when I think about just again, my lived experiences and the first time that I really understood and dealt with racism being when I was basically around my daughter's age, that scares the heck out of me. That these are things that I've experienced since I was just a couple of fingers old. And even now, I'm just trying to find ways to empower myself to make a difference. There's so much there to unpack, and I will say that it starts with just talking about it, and it's hard for me to talk about it. I think the only reason why I'm not breaking down in tears right now is because I've probably talked about it about 500 times just in 2021, and I'm able to to really process what I'm going through. But a lot of people are not. A lot of people are still facing that fear. Every time I turn on the news every day and I see another elderly Asian being violently beaten for really no other reason than their race, it does make me feel helpless. So I do want to just say here that I'm still finding my ground on even just speaking in my own lived experiences and trying to figure out how to integrate that into the platform that I have. And then also trying to, 10 years down the road, hopefully be mentoring others and the mistakes I've made in trying to push this issue forward and make progress, and where I've learned to do things right.
Sure, I speak for Governor Swift and Eileen for commending you for speaking out, and I also speak to you as a parent. My daughter is adopted from South Korea, and so I've kind of experienced some of this, through her eyes as much as a father can. But maybe I just might ask a follow-up. I don't mean to pry, but I read that there were some members of your family that wanted you to be more cautious, perhaps, and not speaking out. And I wanted you if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty consistent. There's certainly a generational divide where, I think the model minority myth is still deeply embedded in my parents' generation. And part of that is if you don't speak up and if you don't make noise and if you don't make trouble, then you can find safety in that. And I feel a reverse, which is by not speaking up, that's where I feel unsafe. And that's where I feel it's going to be unsafe for my daughter.
So before we move to another question, which will lead us to a different topic, Eileen or Governor Swift, do you want to just comment on Lisa's, what Lisa, maybe Eileen, anything you'd like to say about what Lisa's just said?
Well, I think we're having a horrible, terrible, wonderful moment in the United States at the moment, where a lot of people whose lived experience has been hidden in some ways because they didn't feel empowered to speak out, now do feel empowered. And as horrific as the last year has been in the wake of the George Floyd murder and most recently what's happened in the Asian community in San Francisco just yesterday, I think those voices are going to make the difference. I mean, I applaud the mayor for saying that she feels it's important to speak out because if you don't, who will?
Governor Swift, anything you'd like to say on this topic?
No, I just applaud your courage. And I think there are so many issues where we're not sure what the right thing is to do until we think about what it means for our children. And then it becomes really clear what the right thing is to do.
Mayor Wong, I know you need to go. Any parting words or anything you wanted to hope to say that my questions didn't allow you to say in your short time with us?
No, because as Eileen and the governor was speaking, and my daughter was becoming increasingly louder downstairs as well. So she actually wants a few minutes with mommy before she
Okay. All right.
ends the town meeting. But just
Okay.
thank you for including me in this.
Thank you so much for joining us. So Governor Swift, as I mentioned in my introduction, I want to discuss some of the lessons we can take from your experience on Beacon Hill, but I also want to be sure that those controversies related to your serving in high office as a working mother don't overshadow your many accomplishments. So I wanted to give you we don't have time to talk about all of those accomplishments, but I know you're especially proud about the reforms you helped lead in public education and human services, and just wanted you to perhaps talk about that for a minute before we move on to another topic.
Sure. So, I've spent all my time since leaving office continuing to work in education. And I think that it is really clear that education of all of the issues that we're facing as a country. And as Eileen said, this has been both a terrible and a wonderful time. And there is both tremendous challenge and tremendous opportunity right now. We in Massachusetts have been very blessed. I think we did a lot of hard work. I was proud of the work that I did in 1993 in the state Senate as part of the Education Reform Conference Committee. I was proud as Lieutenant Governor and then Governor to implement many of those reforms. But one of the two things we haven't done very well in Massachusetts that really came to light during this pandemic that I work on now in a nonprofit role. One is we have not done a very good job in closing achievement or opportunity gaps, depending which lingo you want to use. Really, the label doesn't matter. The problem is what matters. The most challenged children, traditionally underserved and impoverished communities, we still have tremendous challenges in lifting those children up and getting them the education they need. And that is something we saw certainly exacerbated during this pandemic and will be a generational issue as we return and reopen schools. And secondly, for all the strengths of our economy here in Massachusetts built on an innovation economy, we have not unleashed the power of innovation. In many cases, we were lazy because of the excellence that we had in our schools based in a large part. We did a lot of hard work and a lot of good work, but we also have a lot of smart parents and a lot of highly educated parents, and that takes you a long way. Many of those parents work in the high tech and innovation economy and seem to believe that their kids didn't need to utilize any of those skills when they went to school every day. And that caused huge problems when we pivoted to remote and hybrid learning. But it's also going to cause huge problems when those children pivot into a workforce that is changing at a speed that frankly is dizzying. And so I think we now have an opportunity with the investments that have been made at the federal level, the skills that have been gained through a lot of hard work and tears probably, and challenge by our education establishment to have what Brookings Institute calls a leapfrog moment. So I think there's work to be done, and I'm excited to still be doing it, although in a very undercover kind of way. And then another issue that really was meaningful to me that is in the news again today is some of the work I did on behalf of foster children and children who were in the care of our Department of Children and Families. And this is an ongoing challenge, with the change in society and the change in the structure of families. how we take care of children who are at risk, whose parents either can't or won't take care of them, has been, and Eileen knows this, right? We go through cycles. There's a tragedy ever so often. And when I was lieutenant governor and had had all that attention given to having given birth, I had a member of the governor's staff who came in and said to me, "You're going to have this interview with the Globe, and they're going to ask you what you care about." And I told them the things I cared about. And one was I had worked on this foster care issue as a senator. I said, "I really care about that. And I just had a baby. You absolutely cannot mention that. Children die in foster care. It is a losing political issue." And so the reporter came in to interview me, and you know what I did, because I am so stubborn. Of course, I said, I want to make sure that we have a better system of foster care. And so I had an enemy in the governor's office for the rest of my life. But we did a lot of important things, but it is not a system that will have 100% success. And frankly, I do think, back to our issue talking about the press, it is not a public policy issue that benefits from how press coverage works in Massachusetts or in America. It drives a lot of the wrong decisions and attention to be made, but we were able to extend scholarships and funding for college for children in foster care to encourage more families to adopt and find permanent placements, and a lot of other structural challenges. We increased the pay of social workers. The turnover was incredibly bad. And so we tried to address that issue, but it continues to be an issue that just breaks your heart. But I was proud that I ignored the good political advice and did the right thing to try to bring some attention. And I will say the governor's wife, Lauren Baker, continues to do the same thing and puts a lot of effort. I think the one thing she puts most of her time to is raising funds for children in foster care.
I mean, I'm going to have you comment on that. We often in our virtual forums have a hard time getting people to ask questions, so we entice them by giving away a book. So we will give away a copy of Eileen's book to a randomly chosen person who asks a question. I noticed that Eunice is over your shoulder and she's over my shoulder. She's
Eunice is always over my shoulder.
But before we talk again, I think we'll pivot back to kind of women in politics. But Eileen, maybe this interesting point that the governor's just made on, say, the foster. You've been in those newsrooms, and it is these sensational stories that get covered that's probably scare many normal people away from wanting to get involved with foster children, because you don't want to see yourself, I mean, accidents happen, and then it ends up devolving that maybe it is the wrong people sometimes who get involved. And but anyway, how does that get handled in the newsroom?
Well, I would say there's a parallel here of what happens among journalists. I mean, if you listen to what the governor just said, the issues that you care about are children and education and safety for children. Newsrooms have a tendency to define those things as women's issues. Mm-hmm. Those things are not women's issues. Those are all of our issues. But women tend to care about them. And like the political operative who advised the governor not to emphasize anything having to do with children, it puts me in mind of a letter that I got when I first became a columnist at the Globe. I had been a reporter. I had covered the State House and the United States Congress and done lots of other things at the paper. But, when they give you a column, you get a chance to really write about what you care about most. So a gentleman wrote to me who had followed my career, apparently, and said that he just wanted to caution me that I not do as a columnist what he noted that I did as a reporter, which is gravitate to stories about women and children and poverty and the disenfranchised. And I was a little amused. And I wrote him back, which was the only honest answer I could write back to him, which is I would be happy to write less about those things when my male colleagues wrote about them more. And, to date, that hasn't happened. So I still write about those things. And I think the governor followed her instinct, and so did I. It is true that news is driven by horrific events, and that we do a terrible job of covering systemic issues. It used to be the Department of Social Services. Before, it was the Department of Children and Families, and it's always been a disaster. And it is a disaster because it's not a priority. And the only way you make it a priority, with all due respect to Governor Baker, is you don't assign it to your wife. You do it.
So I would actually so a lot of, and this is probably too long and it will derail, but
that's fine.
When women stayed home, right, and it was a lot easier to take children into your family, right, to have the neighbor's kid who was in trouble. I know families who took in foster children, right? Like it was normal in the neighborhoods that I grew up in. My mother lives in the same house, so that I can compare it to the same neighborhood. People in that neighborhood don't take children in anymore in foster care. In part, the children have much more complicated needs because of drug issues. And so the issues, we also changed a lot of the approach, which I don't disagree with. So now it's much harder to have your children taken away from you, which in many levels is right, but it means that the children who get put in placement have much more complicated medical and psychological issues, and therefore the responsibility that you take on as a foster parent can become a much larger burden. And so the whole structure of society and how we deal with foster care has made it an extraordinarily complicated issue that is just really, really hard to solve. And likely, no matter who's dealing with it and how much emphasis you put on it, things are going to go wrong. And not to say that there aren't at times, I wouldn't say there haven't been terrible mistakes and terrible oversights that need attention and investigation, but often it is an overburdened system because we don't have placements, because we don't have families who have the structure to take in the kinds of the children who need homes. It's a terrible and vexing, like many parts. I mean, it's part of what I love about government, frankly, and part of why I encourage, I'll get us back on track here, Tom. I encourage women and smart young people all the time to go into politics. So, Mayor Wong was saying how difficult it can be, how challenging it can be. Eileen could probably pull out some headlines right now that her colleagues and maybe even she wrote at times about me that weren't all that nice, but I would do it all over again. As I said earlier, you get to help so many people, and you get to solve the most complicated issues. You get to work with some of the smartest people. You get to do work that matters every single day. It is an enormous, enormous privilege to work in politics. And, there's lots of stuff that's hard, and it is absolutely, there are parts of doing it as a woman that are much more challenging. But there are also parts of it that it's easier to do politics as a young female than it is to do a lot of other professions.
So we have our first question. It's quite an interesting one. First, the person is loving this discussion, so that's a nice boost in our How can women in politics and women in the press support each other without jeopardizing the necessary separation between each field? Eileen, you want to take that one on?
Sure. I don't think it's as hard as it might, initially appear. Governor Swift is right. She could go back and find lots of headlines where I kicked her around a little bit. We didn't often agree on policy, but she can also find many columns in which I took on my colleagues who I felt were abusing her, and male politicians. It depends on how powerful your voice can be at any given moment. There's one anecdote that I would share with the questioner. When Governor Swift made the decision, and I think it was a hard one, not to run for the governor's seat, and Mitt Romney ran, the Boston Globe ran a photograph that enraged me because I believe I had spent the day with you, Governor Swift, and we've been having quite a candid conversation about how you felt in this moment in your political career. And the photograph, people who were around at the time will remember it, and I'm sure the governor will. The photograph was accurate in that when the person clicked the shutter, that is an image that really happened. But Governor Swift is not as tall as Mitt Romney. He's standing at a podium, and she, with her very lovely wide eyes, is looking up at him. And the gaze looks like nothing short of adoring. And I think I can say with confidence that that is not what the governor was feeling at that moment. And I stormed into the editor's office. It was a wonderful editor, Marty Barron, who's now gone on to fame and fortune at the Washington Post and recently retired, to say, how could you run that photograph? That photograph is accurate, but it is not truthful. That photograph is a lie. And every woman I know was enraged by that photograph. He, of course, didn't pay any attention to me, which was often my lot at the Boston Globe. But I did have a voice, and I did say it. I might have even written about it. I think that women can support one another without being in debt to one another. And because these are universal slights that ought not to happen. I'm guessing you remember that photograph.
Yeah, Governor, do you want to comment on the photograph or the story or the question?
So I think that, well, first of all, I will say, I think I'd go back to what I said before, that in the moment, I used to say that it wasn't fair to expect me when I was governor to be defending every issue for women and working mothers in the world. It was hard enough to be the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and do that job well. And if I did that job to the best of my ability, that would do more for women than any sort of statement that I could make. And I know that's controversial. I believe the same, and that's obviously short, don't take cheap shots, right? Don't attack other women. And my position has been since then that we should give particularly women who are the onlys or the firsts or groundbreaking the space to do that job exceptionally well without the burden of you must. I think that for the vice president right now, let her do her job as well as she can do her job. Now, once you transition from that job, you are given so many privileges as a former, whether it is teaching, speaking, lecturing, then I believe you have an enormous obligation to pay it forward. And it's at that point, whether it is working together with people across the aisle in the press to try to make an impact, speaking widely with young people about ways to improve all of our public institutions, because the media is a public institution. Speaking out and using your voice, I can get published, frankly, almost anytime I want, and I'm a has-been, right? I'm 20 years out. WBUR will let me speak just about any day I want. I just wrote an op-ed with Maria Flynn for the Boston Globe. I don't do it that much, but I have a tremendous voice now that can be part of the media. So I think then is when you have an obligation on these issues to really speak and be heard.
So I referenced, I'm not sure if I referenced to the audience that there's an interesting interview with you with David Gergen a few years ago at the Kennedy School. And I was particularly interested, this partly is the question of, just doing the job and doing it well. So you're a lieutenant governor and you make a decision that you're going to do that job as well as you can. And then your husband gave up his career to take care of your baby. And you made a decision that the thing you were going to cut out was the socializing, because if your husband's been home all day with the baby and you say, I'm having drinks with Eileen McNamara at the Four Seasons tonight, even though that's work because you need to do that, you can't call him up and say that without him saying, but then, and we won't go through the controversies, but then when you hit some controversies, you didn't have the relationships that you might have been able to have developed had you gone out for the drink after work. Just maybe comment on that.
Yeah, and it was even the, I didn't go to lunch with Frank Phillips, right? Like I thought if I read every briefing book, and this is a little bit of a confidence issue, and a lot of women have that. I thought if I was the smartest, best prepared person in the room, right, that was what would make me successful. And it was a huge mistake, right? There were lots of people who could have whispered in my ear if I had forgot a stat about something, but not having developed those relationships, there was a point at which I was in fairly deep political water, and Gloria Larson and Pat McGovern and a few other women started pulling together these lunches for me. And I began sort of making the circuit, but it was late by then. And one of the deep leadership lessons, and frankly, I owe all of those women and that period a huge debt of gratitude, because I've never made that mistake since. An important leadership lesson for anyone is you need to consult a lot of people when you're making big leadership decisions, even if you know the answer. Because when you make the decision and it doesn't go exactly right, all those people need to feel like they were invested in helping you to make that decision, so that when it goes wrong, they stand beside you. I'll give you a perfect example. The gosh darn tolls on the turnpike. Your Boston Globe was every single day saying that we had pledged the increased tolls on the turnpike, right? And we couldn't go back and we had to maintain those tolls and blah, 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 blah. And so when Christy Mijos and Jordan Levy started spouting crazy stuff, that's not what I wanted to say, right? And I turned on my party and did the right thing, which is probably what did me in with Mitt Romney as much as anything, and stood up to them and sort of wouldn't say, no, we're going to roll back the tolls, right? Nobody at the Globe backed me up. I couldn't believe it. But you know what? I never went in and sat with them and listened to them tell me why it was so important. And I never met with whatever that business trade group, probably their name, right?
Associated Industries.
Blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right? All the developers and all the big guys in downtown. If I had taken a couple of hours, right, to go, Steve Crosby to this day, right? He loses his mind because he's like, they all told me, but they told him.
Yeah, they didn't tell you.
And I didn't, and that has to this day, and by the way, there's gender issues to that, Tom, right? Because I had this reputation, which people who know me, I have a little bit, I can be a little bit of a wise ass, but people are like, oh, she's arrogant, right? She's so arrogant. She's so arrogant. She's such a smart, but where that came from is I wasn't going around Boston to a bunch of people I didn't know, and I didn't know who they were, but if I had asked, I would have, asking them all what I should do. And I didn't even know, and this is a issue for people who aren't in power. This is apparently how things are done in Boston, which I know now. And by the way, I do it now. You should see the event I'm putting together at the end of June. I am asking everybody, and there are, but this is, you go around and you ask them all. And by the way, it is the right thing to do because none of us know everything and you want to build support. But I had no idea. I didn't know you were supposed to go ask all these mostly guys. Like, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do it? Blah, 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 blah. And it was a huge mistake. And one, that by the time I figured it out, it was too late.
I mean, you want to just comment on?
Yes,
Governor's
stop
observation.
beating yourself up for that, Governor. Because you know what? I think Elizabeth Warren would say, what was the book on her? She was arrogant. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. She read all the briefing books, just like you. And I think that there's a price to pay, whether you take those lunches or you don't take those lunches. Because if you're confident about what you know, because you did read all those briefing books, then you're too big for your britches. And you were young. That was also a deficit that you had to face with the people that had power. You were a young governor. Never mind that Paul Cellucci was young too when he was elected to the legislature, but you were 25 when you were elected from the Berkshires? So he was 28, I think. But it didn't matter for him. It did matter for you. And I think that holds through all of your career in politics for not just you, but for anyone. If the worst thing you can say about Senator Warren is that she's just too smart and she's too competent, I guess that says more about us than it says about the senator.
I want to pivot just briefly. It seems like television is a particularly unfriendly medium. I think Governor Swift, you've said that for you, even your husband said sometimes he didn't recognize the person he knew and loved when he saw you on the screen. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So partly if I thought somebody was an idiot, that you could read that in my face. And unfortunately, if I thought the reporter was an idiot, then the people on the other side of the screen who are the viewers I thought they were the idiots. So that was a problem every single time. But TV is a tough medium. It's a very tough medium. And my humor at times was a little bit edgy and it would land in a small room. To this day, I can give great speeches in small rooms, and except for among my children, although now that the youngest are turning 20, this may change. But people find me very funny, and it didn't always land through the medium of TV. I would appear angry.
Angry? Oh, can't be angry.
No. See, so I'm very pregnant.
Angry and pregnant, there's a combo. So if you're impassioned, you're angry. I mean, every single woman who runs for public office has to read about her tone of voice. Why is she yelling at us? Well, she's not yelling.
You can do things. So I was a really good public speaker in the Senate, and I was known for that. And I had to acknowledge that speaking in the Senate and giving a speech and speaking through this little box are completely different skills. And this is another thing that I tell, like, your strengths can become a weakness if you apply them in a different context, and you have to be humble enough to say, oh, I need to practice that. I need to get better at that. And we can all benefit from practice.
Well, yes, I agree with you about that too. But I covered John Kerry in the Senate in the 80s. And I think Howie Carr nicknamed him Live Shot, right? Because he was always in front of the television camera.
Yeah, except for when he was supposed to be at that hearing with me.
Except when he was supposed to be there for you and he was not there for you. But I don't think Senator Kerry spent 2 seconds thinking about how he was coming across on that little box because he was so assured that he was where he was supposed to be and that what he said mattered. And he didn't worry about his tone of voice.
So there is some good research, and there are a lot of women in entertainment who did believe that beginning to cast women in different roles and roles of power, that part of our problem with women in political positions is we were so unaccustomed to seeing women through television and in positions that were not just models, which I used to make the joke that I realized early on cheekbones were not going to be my ticket to success. So imagine my surprise when all of a sudden it mattered again. But so see, again, like that was funny in person, not so much when I was talking on TV. It just is, we see more women CEOs talking on Squawk Boxes. We see more women in, television roles in different positions. We just have to have more women in positions of power across all industries. I mean, having women political leaders be the leading tip of the arrow isn't going to cut it. We're going to have to see women in other industries leading to sort of acclimate us that this is an okay, normal thing.
With just a few minutes left, Eileen, this is an unfair question because we do a whole hour on Eunice Shriver, but she's turning 100. She would have turned 100 this year. And you believe if she had been born at a different time that she would have been potentially an immensely successful candidate. Just give us a word or two about Eunice Shriver. And
well, I subtitled the book "The Kennedy Who Changed the World" because this is a controversial position that I take, but I can defend it. That she left the most lasting legacy of anyone in that family. And it's not the Special Olympics. Marvelous as the Special Olympics it is the legislation that exists now, including the Americans with Disability Act. That was the legislation that gives kids the right to an education in a public school if they have intellectual disabilities. None of that exists without Eunice Shriver, and nobody knows about it. And they don't know about it in part because of the family she came from. If we think that the world is sexist at large, can you imagine growing up as a Kennedy woman? Here's just an example about my own profession's failure on this issue. When Joseph P. Kennedy, the patriarch, died in 1969, the subhead in the New York Daily News said he left one son. There were 4 daughters who were still alive. So she would have been extraordinary in politics. The saddest letter that I found in going through her personal papers was a letter she wrote to her father in the late 50s. "Dear Daddy," she wrote, "why are you spending so much time on everyone else's career? What about me?" And she knew the answer to that, and so do we. It's because she was a Kennedy woman, not a Kennedy man.
So if I have 2 minutes,
yes,
one of the interesting things when I'm in forums with other women, Shannon O'Brien, Martha Coakley, one of the consistent things that you find of women who are some of the first to run successfully for office is often our fathers encouraged us. They were involved in politics, and they, despite it not being something that was done at the time, but they saw no difference in encouraging their daughters or their sons to be involved in politics. So did not get that letter from their daughters. And my father was my inspiration throughout my life and basically cranked the numbers for every single one of my campaigns and put together the winning vote model. So, and was with me, Tom, you may not remember, but at that event, as he was
I do remember that,
at Northfield Mount Hermon. So there's something interesting there. Eileen had her father encouraged her.
Well, one can only imagine how proud he must have been to see you become governor of the Commonwealth. So let's end with a parenting question, and I hope a hopeful one. So you both raised daughters. They have entered or are entering the world, and a world quite different than the one both of you entered when you were their age. Maybe just as a parting comment, we have made some progress. What makes you hopeful? Maybe we'll start with Eileen, and then we'll end with you, Governor Swift.
Well, I can keep it short. I wouldn't get in Katie May's way. I mean, if she wants to do it, she'll do it. And I'd like to think I played a little part in that. And I know her father did. This is a tough generation of young women that will make their mark.
Governor Swift.
So one of the things that I worried about all the time, right? I think all of us do who are working mothers, but especially when you're reading criticism about the choice that you're making, it internalizes a little bit. And I am fortunate now to see that I have three extraordinary, very different daughters. And I agree with Eileen. I have great hope. And you know, we were talking earlier, so my daughters are all in college, and like many young people, their sort of formative experiences have been greatly impacted by this pandemic, but the greatest generation was formed by a generational experience that was terrible of World War II. They talk of it now, right, as this sort of iconic formative experience. I see greatness in this generation, and they have lived through a generational experience. And I think we have the next greatest generation, and they have certainly seen all of the problems we need them to solve.
Well, what a delightful way to spend the last hour, Governor Swift. Thank you, Eileen McNamara. We thank all of you for joining us. Our next forum is Tuesday night. I'll be speaking with Sarah Seeger, an astrophysicist at MIT, who's also a resident here in Concord and featured in our new exhibit, again, that I hope you'll come visit. Thank you all very much for joining us, and good night.